Hello everyone, thank you for attending today's Watershed webinar, How Will We Feed 11 Billion? Our presenter is Dr. Benjamin Roman, Postdoctoral Fellow of Environmental Engineering at St. Francis University.
So my name is Ben Roman. I'm a postdoc in environmental engineering here at St. Francis. A little bit about my background before I start the presentation. I was born and raised southwest of Pittsburgh. I went to Penn State for my bachelor's, master's, and PhD. So I was at Penn State for 11 years total. My bachelor's is in civil engineering. I have a master's of engineering and environmental engineering, and then I also have a PhD in environmental engineering. So I'll tell you a little bit towards the end of the talk about the work that I did during my PhD and how it relates to all this topic. So I just want to, as a preamble here, this talk is really broad and it looks at agriculture and food production on a global perspective. I realize that my audience in this series is targeted for the Chesapeake Bay area and watershed impacts. So I just want to state that agriculture in general has just inherent impacts on watersheds, just due to irrigation, water use, nutrient runoff, manure from livestock operations affecting streams and whatnot. So while I may not reference specifically the Chesapeake Bay watershed very frequently, all of these things I'm talking about do affect it and I'll apply to that too. So with that, I'll get started. So basically, since the dawn of humans, agricultural production advances and population growth rates have been very related. In our history, we've had three major agricultural revolutions that have allowed us to increase our population growth rate. The first being the Neolithic revolution that happened around 10,000 BC. And this is when humans started to leave the hunter-gatherer ways and start to adopt agriculture. So we started to use seeds, planting food, and this really allowed us to, for the first time in our history, to create cities or population centers where we could have like large densities of humans that could be fed due to the agriculture that we were growing. Skip ahead about 11,000, 12,000 years, where population was kind of increasing steadily through a lot of this time. And around the 1700s, and this kind of couples with the Industrial Revolution, they call it the British Agricultural Revolution. And what this did was it added machines or mechanized agriculture. So there were advances in transportation, large-scale irrigations, and just kind of using more advanced technology to propel the agricultural output that we could have, which again had a large impact on how fast our population can grow. And then the final agricultural revolution, known as the Green Revolution, that happened in the 50s and 60s in the developed world. And this kind of, it links up with kind of a scientific revolution, you can call it, where penicillin was being produced and medicine started to become very widespread. So there were a lot of increases in our technologies in terms of producing synthetic fertilizers or agrochemicals like pesticides, more controlled irrigation or methods of cultivation, and even like gene editing so we can get higher yielding variety of crops. So while this is all necessary in order for us to sustain the population that we have today, you could argue that agriculture itself is the most powerful force that we have unleashed onto the planet as humans. And this figure kind of depicts what that would look like. So if we're starting here on the left, we're starting with pre-settlement, pre-humans, we just have all natural ecosystems. And the y-axis here is showing the proportion of the landscape, so all natural. As humans move in, we start to clear frontiers and then grow subsistence agriculture or small-scale farms to support our urban areas. And then that keeps expanding until we start to hit this intensive agriculture part where we're starting to get very high yielding or large agricultural operations to support our urban population. And then today, this is kind of where we're living in this intensive area where like almost 50% or more of the land that we have is used to grow food to support us. And this is just another look at basically what I just said there. So at the top here, we're looking at Earth's surface. It's about 30% land, 71% ocean. Out of that, about 30% land, 70% of it is habitable. The other, 30% are either glaciers or beaches or deserts or something. Of that 70% habitable land, about 50% of it we're using to grow food. The others are, urban areas, that's just like 1%, some fresh water is 1%, forests, and then shrubs or grasslands. So of that 50% that we're growing agriculture, 77% of it is used to either support livestock for grazing or to grow food to feed livestock. The other 22% is, or 23% is for crops that we directly eat. And then they further relate this to the global calorie supply. So of that 77% of the land that we're using to produce meat, we're only getting 18% of our global calorie supply versus the crops are producing 82%, even though it's much less land. And that will make more sense as I go into this talk a bit more. So here's another kind of just world map. I'm going to show you guys a bunch of world maps today. And this one shows the areas around the world that are used for either pastures or cropland. So you can see basically all of the arable land on the entire globe we're using to either grow livestock or food to support us. So the areas that aren't are mostly deserts or, the Arctic areas, deserts in Africa here. This is the rainforest in South America, which you all probably know we are encroaching on pretty rapidly to grow more food. And this is just another look at the percentage of the total land area that's used for agriculture based on the country. So some of these countries, like in parts of Asia and Africa and Europe, over 50% of their total land area is used to grow food. In the United States, we're around like 25 to 30% of our total land area is used to grow agriculture. And this is just another kind of way of looking at it. So here we're looking at the terrestrial vertebrate biomass that's shown on the y-axis here. And on our x-axis, we're showing different time periods. So, back in 10,000 BC, when we just started farming, it was all basically wild animals. And as we've progressed as a species, we started domesticating animals, and we end up where, in the year 2000, probably like 40 to 50% of the total land animal biomass is our domesticated animals. And projecting that out to 2050, it just keeps increasing. And just to link this to the Chesapeake Bay watershed, I was showing you maps where we were looking at the percentage of agriculture that is in a given area. So this is showing the Chesapeake Bay watershed and the land use in that area. So yellow here is highlighting agriculture. So you can see we are not immune or exempt from any of this. There is a ton of agriculture in this Bay area that will contribute to all of these impacts that we were discussing. So as I mentioned, agriculture is necessary to sustain our population, but it has many negative environmental impacts. So one of them being greenhouse gas emissions. So food production is responsible for about 26% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. It uses about 50% of the global habitable land. It uses 70% of our global freshwater withdrawals. And it's responsible for about 78% of global ocean and freshwater pollution. So eutrophication is a term that as an environmental engineer I use on a daily basis, but it's basically these dead zones that are around the Chesapeake Bay is one of them, the Gulf of Mexico also, that are caused due to large nutrient loads or nutrient runoff going into these areas. Algal blooms form, the algae dies, all the dissolved oxygen's depleted from the water body, and then natural fish and other aquatic life can't live there. So agriculture is 80% responsible for that's happening around the globe. And then finally, biodiversity. 94% of the global animal biomass is our livestock, leaving only 6% is wild animals. So in many of areas, agriculture is required to be grown where it really shouldn't be. So this is a farm here in Yuma County, Arizona, which if you go to their website, at least like a few years ago when I did this, they claim to be the winter vegetable capital of the world, which is great. But because of operations like this, we have things occurring like this, where I'm showing the Colorado River in the 1950s here and then the Colorado River today. So we're depleting a lot of our natural freshwater resources in order to grow agriculture in areas where it necessarily shouldn't be grown, or it wouldn't grow naturally at least. And going into the future here, so this map is from NOAA. It is predicting changes in precipitation by the end of this century. So this is inches of liquid water per year. So you can see the chart on the right here, the orange that you can see in parts of the United States, most of Europe, a lot of South America and Africa and Asia. We're looking at, like 10 to 30 inches per year reductions in precipitation. And to put that into context, the United States on average gets 30 inches of rain per year. So, we're looking at almost 100% reduction or no rain potentially in some areas in the United States. Other areas are actually expected to get more rain. So us up here in the northeast corner, we're actually it's predicted that we'll have more rain. So maybe not issues with drought so much and growing food, but flooding, other things like that. And this lack of rainfall, we've already seen that it's starting to inhibit the production of agriculture throughout the world. So there's a study done in 2011 that looked at areas around the world where agricultural yields were starting to reduce due to less rainfall. So these are the areas in red that are shown here on the 2011 map, and then they project that out based on climate models into 2050. So you can see basically like everywhere that we grow food is going to have reduction in yield due to less rainfall. And at the same time that we're having these declining yields, the world's population is increasing, but they're also becoming more heavily involved in meat. So a lot of the areas around the world are still developing. As they become more affluent, they start to eat more meat. They start to require more animal products. So this figure here shows the world global use of meat, so beef, pork, and chicken. And it goes from 2000, when we're about 190 million metric tons, to up to 2019, where we've increased that by nearly 100 metric tons. And this is just projected to continue to increase as population increases and as a lot of these developing areas become developed. So this is just another look at that. So a study done by the Food and Agriculture Organization looking at meat use to 2050. So beef or bovine expected to decrease by 60%. There's some other ones here, but if you add them all up, we are having basically a 60% or a 1.6 times increase on the amount of meat products that we're going to need by the year 2050. So I feel like I keep repeating myself here, but I'm saying, and just showing this in another way, so that this figure on the left here is showing the world population growth from 1960 to 2030. And at the same time, our arable land, so the land that we potentially have to grow food per capita, is decreasing just due to population increase, but also due to expanding urban areas, encroaching on what could have been agricultural land now where we have to live or where population centers are growing. All right, so I think that's our first poll, which I'll pause for maybe a minute to give you guys a second.
All right, so it looks like everybody has answered. So I will end. Oh.
All right, so we got one wild caught, one farmed, and most people don't care. All right, that's good. So I've been talking a lot about agriculture, right, and growing food on land, but I haven't mentioned fish, right? So we're running out of land to grow food, but we have like vast oceans and water all over the fresh water that we could potentially have aquatic fish farms or ocean caught fish that could potentially add to our calorie intake or the protein. But there's issues involved with those also. So I'm first going to talk about aquaculture or fishing farm. Farmed fishing. This can be done, on land in a freshwater pond or a basin, or it can be done sometimes off the coast. So they could have these like large nets in the shore areas around the oceans where they grow saltwater fish. But the problem with these fish or these fishing operations is that, we live in a capitalistic society, so profits kind of drive everything, right? So we want to use this little space as we possibly can to get a bunch of fish in here that our revenue can be as high as it possibly can. But in order for that to happen, we have fish that are essentially living in such dense conditions that they're basically swimming in their own feces. And this is a problem environmentally because we have huge nutrient loads, organic loads from their fish waste. that has environmental impacts. But also, in order to keep these fish alive and healthy, we need to dose them with antibiotics because they're living in filth. And a lot of the times, in order for them to reproduce in these conditions, we have to feed them hormones too, because they won't naturally reproduce living like this. So those antibiotics and hormones get ingested by the fish, and then in turn get ingested by the humans that are eating them. And there's conflicting arguments about that, and it's still sort of an area of contention where how antibiotics and pharmaceuticals are affecting not just us, but the natural world too. And I'll kind of end there without going on too much of a rant about what any of that is. But if you guys have other questions about this, I'm sure you can find information online. I have my email at the end on the final slide. So if you are interested in this stuff, feel free to reach out to me. This is like, I can talk about this stuff over beers for hours. It's like where I live mentally, which is kind of a sad place, but here we are. So that's fish farming. Ocean caught fish. I have a little video here that depicts how this is done. So basically, we have these ships that have these giant nets that kind of look like socks, and we just kind of dredge them through the ocean, and we pick up whatever we catch. So a lot of the times you can actually catch 5 pounds of untargeted fish species for every 1 pound of targeted fish species. So if we wanted to catch tuna, we may catch 10 tuna, but also catch 50, I don't know, sharks, dolphins, turtles, whatever. And that has consequences too. So this is like kind of like cute little cartoon that depicts how this goes on. All right. So because of this, there's projections that if we keep fishing our oceans at the rate that we are right now, that they could be completely depleted by fish by 2048, which is a little terrifying. I'm not even sure what the ecosystem impacts of that would be, but I'm sure it would be detrimental to us, that if our oceans were void of fish life. And you can see kind of some examples here. So this is looking at southern bluefin tuna from 1960 up into like the 1995s, where the biomass in the oceans was up around 500 or 600 thousands of tons. And then due to us fishing so much, you can see that decreasing and down to like nearly nothing. And a lot of this has to do with the untargeted part that I mentioned too, but we also will dump out a lot of these fish that we don't deem sellable. If they're not up to standards or a certain size, they'll get sorted and then dumped back into the ocean. A lot of times they're dead or don't survive at that too. So we're just really wasteful and not really conscious about what we're doing in the oceans. At least we weren't, and I think that's starting to change, thankfully. Okay, so to kind of wrap up all that uplifting information, we have this issue where we have growing demands, mostly in the developing world. Population's growing, diets are changing, they're starting to eat more meat, which requires more resources. And they're having higher demands for energy material crops too. So biofuels, cotton for clothing, those types of things. And at the same time, in the developed world, due to climate change, soil exhaustion, and loss of farmland to urbanization, we have declining yields. And I'll get more into this on the next few slides here. I just wanted to kind of bring it all together before it was too lost, because I'm going over so many topics here at once. So this was a study that was done in 2018 by Berners-Lee et al., where we're looking at the global food energy. So I'm showing the units here as kilocalories per person per day. So a kilocalorie is just a calorie that you would see on whatever your food product is that you look at. Kilocalorie is just kind of the scientific correct term for it. So you could think, maybe like a 2,000 calorie per person per day diet is like what we reference a lot. And I think in this study, they're looking at a required intake of like 2,353 calories per day per person. That's like what their average intake is. So we start here on the left is basically what can the planet produce? So we have like 6,000 or so that are produced from edible grown crops, and another about 4,000 that are consumed by livestock in grass or pastures. So essentially we have 6,000 that we can eat without what's been eaten by our livestock already. There's some losses when it's harvested. There's some losses post-harvesting. You go through manufacturing processes. It's just not 100% efficient. You're going to have losses like that. And then we get to allocation. So of the 5,265 calories per person per day that we have in crops, 1,738 of those are fed to animals. So you can think like corn fed to beef cattle or something. 2,522 of those calories are left for us to eat. And then we have some losses here due to non-food uses. So like, clothing or biofuels or something. There's some losses to international trading and some stuff like that. And then if we jump over to one more, so pre-processing and distribution, we can kind of see the impact of animals here, where we had some losses just due to efficiencies in our processes, but we have a lot of losses going to animals, right? So there's a ton of calories that we are feeding to these animals that are just lost because these animals, our beasts, aren't efficient in terms of their calorie recycling, right? So you may feed a cow like 20,000 calories over its life. I'm just making numbers up. I have no idea. But then you get from that in beef, maybe only like 2,000 calories or something. They're not efficient. We're losing a lot through cows eating plants and then being slaughtered and producing beef. And that's shown here, like 5,000 kilocalories are being lost to animals, and we're only getting, 594 back out of that. And then we keep going down the line. There's some more losses. But we're left with, 178 calories per day per person excess in 2013. So, we still have a little more than we need, but it's getting close. And then this figure shows how this is really not spread evenly. So we're looking again at the calories that are produced or imported in different regions of the world. And I don't really care if you guys pay attention to the legend here. The most important part are these green dashed lines that are showing the net export and import. So areas that have a positive green line are exporting calories. So like North America, for instance, we export a ton of food. But other areas like North Africa or industrialized Asia, they have to import food. So that's what this has showed. And you can see how spread out it is, right? So in like the United States, we're producing nearly 20,000 kilocalories per person per day. In other areas of the world, they're producing less than 5,000. So I just wanted to throw that in there so that you guys know how much of a difference there is depending on where you live. And I'm showing that again here. So this just shows another world map where what countries are importing food, basically. So the gray countries are net exporters, like the United States, Brazil. And then the colored countries are importing, some more than 50% of their food. So like Saudi Arabia, parts of Africa have to import like a ton of food compared to what they need. And then, most are importing like a low amount, less than 20%. And this is from 2018, so pretty recently. And what's kind of sad about this is if you compare this graph to the area of percentage of population that are undernourished. So this map is showing here the percentage of population undernourished. So, in the United States, there's not many people that are undernourished. We have plenty of food, but in parts of Africa, in the Middle East and China, there's a lot of people that don't have enough food or are essentially starving. And if I flip back and forth between these two figures, you can see a strong resemblance between the countries that are importing food and the countries that have a high percentage of population that are undernourished. All right. So there was a study done in 2017 by an organization called Grow Intelligence, and they're basically data scientists. They look at global agricultural trading data. And they did this study where they looked at countries that are importing calories. So this figure here is showing calorie gaps. So this would be like the amount of calories that a country needs to support its population minus the amount of calories that country produces in agriculture. So like China, for instance, doesn't produce as much calories as it requires for its population. So it has to import a bunch, like 400 trillion calories. So that's what that calorie gap is. And this was in 2017 or 16. And they project that out, a decade or so in advance to 2027. So these three areas, India, Africa, and China mostly, are experiencing population growth, and they're becoming more affluent. So they're increasing their calorie gap. Over time, as time moves on, their population grows, they're going to need to import more calories. The same time that that's happening, the areas that are currently providing these excess calories for them, like the United States, Europe, and South America, their yields are becoming stagnant. So I kind of went over this in the beginning, climate change, soil exhaustion, whatnot. Many of the areas that are, the breadbasket countries, as I call them, are stagnating in their agricultural production. So South America, they're projecting, is still going to increase a bit, but really this is at the death of the rainforest that we're cutting down to grow more food down there right now. And what this leads to is that by 2027, they estimate that there's going to be this gap of 214 trillion calories. So the calorie gap in India and Africa, China, is going to be 514 trillion, and the surplus in North America, South America, and Europe is only going to be 300 trillion. So we have this large gap, and 214 trillion calories is kind of an obscure number. Like, what the hell does that really mean, right? So if you figure it out, it's actually equal to 379 billion Big Macs, which is more Big Macs than McDonald's has ever sold in its entire history, which is a little scary because it's a lot of food. So I don't want to pretend that I'm an international politic expert. I know nothing about foreign policy or foreign affairs or any of this stuff, but I did a lot of this work during my PhD, which was a couple years ago. And while I'm making these slides or going through this stuff, I'm thinking to myself, like, the next big war that we're going to have is going to be a war over food. I could just envision that happening. I don't know. So when the Russia invaded Ukraine, and that's where my brain went, was like, I wonder if this has anything to do with food. And I'm not saying that it does. I'm sure it's multifaceted. I'm sure there's many reasons. But I think this is probably one of them. So I'm just showing headlines here. This one, I'm sorry, was from last month. Biden warns food shortages are going to be real across the globe because of Putin invading the world's breadbasket, Ukraine. Ukraine is an agricultural powerhouse, so it's the EU's fourth biggest external food supplier and provides the bloc with about a quarter of its cereal and vegetable imports, including almost half of its corn. And if you go back a little bit in time to like 2021 and 2020, there's a bunch of articles coming out of Russia where Putin's drive to tame food prices threatens the grain sector, and he's urging higher competitiveness of natural agriculture on world markets because they were having issues in Russia where their agricultural production was low. They were importing a lot due to sanctions and other things. Their food prices were going up, skyrocketing. So again, I don't want to act like I understand why somebody's invading another country, but I would think that this maybe has something to do with it. And this figure is just showing the global food prices and how they're surging amid this war. So obviously the reason for this is due to sanctions and things that are coming out of the war happening, but you could potentially envision something else like this happening if a country no longer has enough food to support its population. I don't think that they're just going to sit around and let their people starve. So it's a little scary, in my opinion, and I think it could have large impacts on not just people's health or their amount of food they have, but political international politics too. All right, so what can be done to overcome this large food shortage that is looming on us? And really, there's three options. So the first one is changing consumption patterns, and I think I have another poll here. Yeah. So before I move on, I have a quick question for you guys here. So how many gallons of water do you think are required to produce one cheeseburger?
All right, I'm going to close it off here and share the results.
All right, so you guys are smart. Most of you got it right, actually. So it is 634, okay? So to produce one cheeseburger, it requires 2,400 liters or 634 gallons of water. If you took all the beef in the world and you put them in one nation, or all the cattle, all the cows, and they were their own nation, they would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter behind China and the United States. They use 33% of all water from farm animal production. 25% of the Earth's land is used for pasture land for cattle. This is excluding the land in Antarctica. And the beef demand is expected to grow by nearly double by 2050. So this is only going to get more intense or more extreme. So if there's one thing that any of us could do, if you're worried about this or want to, have an impact on it, is just to eat less meat. And I feel like I need to follow this up with a little backstory about myself. So like, I'm not a vegan or anything. I don't like, I'm not like the PETA person that's strapping myself to like a slaughterhouse because I care more about the cow's life than my own or something. I grew up in rural Pennsylvania. Like, if there wasn't meat on the plate, it really wasn't a meal for my family. So like, I ate a lot of meat during my childhood and teen years. And when I got to college, I started learning about this stuff, and I felt like in order to go on this career, I sort of needed to like walk the walk, talk the talk. So I did go vegetarian for a few years. I gained a lot of weight because I was eating a lot of pasta. So now, I will eat meat. Mostly it's chicken and turkey because they have the lowest impact on the scale between like beef, pork, and birds. But I'll still eat a hamburger every once in a while. I'm just very conscious about this. Like if I had a hamburger yesterday, I'm definitely not going to have a hamburger today. Like I think about that, and I try to reduce the impact based on my diet. And I think it's really important. That's why I think this paradigm shift almost needs to happen in order for us to really combat this issue. Okay. So that's my eat less meat spiel. The other one is reducing food waste. So in the United States, the average American throws around 209 to 254 pounds of edible food away each year. 30 to 50% of the food that makes it to the supermarket shelf is thrown away in the homes of people that purchase it. 40% of the food in the US is never eaten. And in 2010, discarded food represented the largest single component of municipal solid waste reaching landfills or incinerators. So there's some more stats up here. If the US wasted just 5% left food, it could feed another 4 million Americans, and 15%, it's another 25 million Americans. So food waste is another big thing. This is something I'm a huge culprit with. I'm not good with like checking the expiration dates and stuff that I have in my fridge. And a lot of the time, like I'll end up, having my spring cleaning where I throw away like a carton of eggs from last year or something. So I'm guilty of this too. I'm sure we all are, but it's just something else you can be conscious of to try to reduce your impact on all of this. But really the problem with these two solutions are that they require people in the surplus regions, so like you and I in the United States, to change our behavior on behalf of someone else living across the world that we will never meet probably in these deficient regions. And I like to think that I'm a pretty empathetic person, but it's still hard to like make this the reason because we don't see it affecting us directly in our own lives. It's affecting someone 4,000 miles across the country or world, So that leaves us with a third option of increasing yields. And this is really what is being done to combat this currently. So mostly in India and Africa, a lot of these developing regions have still like very small scale or low yielding agriculture. So there's a lot of organizations like the UN, the Food and Agriculture Organization that are working with these areas to sort of leapfrog this green revolution that occurred in like the 1950s and 60s in the United States and Europe, so that they can start using these advanced technologies that we have in these countries, in their own countries, to increase their agricultural output. So that's hopefully, in what's going on right now, and we'll hope combat this so that a lot of these areas won't have to import so much food. They'll have more that they can produce in their own countries. The third kind of option within increasing yields is in the developed world, like North America, South America, Europe, to develop new technologies or strategies to increase the efficiency of agriculture and livestock production. So just creating it more sustainable ways to produce food. And this is where my research lived, and what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the presentation here is one strategy for doing this. All right, so one of the strategies, like I mentioned, is to develop more sustainable sources of protein, probably to feed to the livestock or fish, but also that we could eat directly. So one of them is insects. I don't think many of us want to eat this directly anyway, but The problem with insects is they typically have low nutritional quality. So they are everywhere, like they're very available, but they usually have low protein contents, which isn't great when you're trying to produce a really meaty cow or something. Algae is another place that's been looked at a lot. It has very high nutritional content, so very high protein contents, like 50%. The problem with algae is that it takes like a lot of manufacturing or post-processing to get it to a point that it's ready to be fed to an animal or to a human. It grows underwater. It needs to be harvested. It needs to be dried. It needs to be ground and milled. So there's still a lot of energy or impacts that go into that. And then finally, duckweed, which is what I worked with during my PhD. It's this tiniest plant. I'll talk more about it. It has protein contents that are like comparable to algae, but it floats on the surface of water, so it's really easy to harvest. But there hasn't been a lot of work like on large scale applications with duckweed yet. And that's kind of what the point of my research was, to see the feasibility of this. All right, so one more poll after this, or is this last poll maybe? So the first question is, have you ever heard or seen of duckweed before? And then the next one is just, do you have any knowledge about wastewater treatment? And that'll make sense why I'm asking that question shortly.
So here are the results.
All right, so we have a bunch of wastewater treatment experts. Cool. And most of you have heard about duckweed also. Okay, good. All right, so if you haven't heard of duckweed, you might have seen it and confused it with algae. I have a slide here that follows up this one where I'll explain duckweed, but this is a schematic of what a common wastewater treatment plant looks like. And I don't expect you guys to understand this or anything. I just want to point some things out. So in raw wastewater, and I apologize if you guys do already know some of this stuff. I know maybe we have some environmental science teachers and things like that that probably are familiar with this. But urea or urine it's mostly made out of ammonia, which is NH4+. So it's the most reduced form of nitrogen. We take this ammonia-rich stream and put it into this tank that has an anoxic zone, so a zone that has low dissolved oxygen, and an aerobic zone, so a zone that we pump air into so that the dissolved oxygen is high. When this ammonia enters this anoxic tank, nothing really happens. But when it reaches this aerobic tank, it gets oxidized to nitrate, go through a process called nitrification. That nitrate, then we recycle back to this anoxic tank where other bacteria do a process called denitrification, which reduces the nitrate to nitrogen gas. So the nitrogen gas then just kind of volatilizes into the atmosphere. No one really cares. The atmosphere is like 78% nitrogen. It doesn't harm anything. So what I want you to take from this is we have ammonia and it gets turned into nitrogen gas. And that's how we get rid of it in wastewater treatment. And we do that because if we let it, go out into a stream raw or something, you could have horrible environmental problems from that. So what I propose to do, and what I think this is really dumb because we have like a valuable source of nutrients here that we could use for something that we are then off-gassing into the atmosphere that we can't get back in terms of, very easily. Maybe in centuries it will be fixed by some bacteria, but we have this very rich stream that we aren't using currently. So what I looked at was taking this nitrified wastewater, so a nitrate-rich wastewater, and taking it from a wastewater treatment system and trying to do something with it by growing plants. So you can grow plants with this nitrate that can be used for animal feed. They can be used for biofuel. They can be directly used as fertilizer by tilling them into the soil. I looked at protein. That was my big thing. So I looked at animal feed. And that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time here. And I'm realizing that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try and fly through this part of the research, but I'm happy to answer questions at the end if you guys have any questions. So the reason we looked at duckweed is because it's a prime candidate for bridging this gap between wastewater nutrients and plant protein. And because of the reason for that is it has high protein contents. It grows extremely fast. So it doubles in mass for 2 to 4 days. So like if I had a pond that was growing with duckweed, I harvested half of that. In 2 to 4 days, I could come back and it would be at that same density that it was originally. It's easily harvested because it floats. It's small and uniform size. It means that there's not a lot of post-processing that needs to be done to get it to the point that it can be eaten. And it also grows under a wide variety of water quality conditions. So the research that I did was conducted in this facility called the Penn State Eco Machine. So it's an ecological wastewater treatment system that is housed inside this greenhouse at the Penn State campus. If you guys are interested in looking at this, I know my advisor does, or my previous advisor does a lot of tours at this facility. So you could take your classes out to view these things. She loves giving talks to high school students. This is a picture from the inside here. So the wastewater actually flows through these 2 tanks here, which are anoxic, and then it goes into these 2 other tanks with these plants that are aerobic. And then finally, in this 3rd tank, we have duckweed growing, which I'm showing here. So this duckweed is growing on nitrate-rich water. It's gone through the aerobic process, like I showed in that schematic earlier. And I did 4 studies with this duckweed. So I looked at the protein quantity. So how much protein can you produce in a system like this? I looked at health safety. So obviously we're growing this duckweed on wastewater. There could be pathogens or other things that could potentially hurt the animal or whatever is consuming it. We also looked at protein quality. So not only can you produce a bunch of protein, but we want to make sure that that protein is digestible or is like contributing to the animal's growth. And then I used a method called a life cycle assessment, which I'll briefly describe later, that kind of just tries to quantify the environmental impacts of a system like this, where you are treating wastewater and producing some beneficial byproduct from it. And then finally, looking at this directly used in agricultural applications. So if you were to grow duckweed on like dairy cow manure, that would be then fed back to the cow. And at the bottom here, I just have those 5 topics kind of highlighted so that we can follow where we're going here. So the first is protein quantity. So that duckweed that I showed that was growing in the eco machine, I grew it for several months. I measured the growth rate, which is shown by the green bars here. Duckweed on the right, I'm comparing it to common land grown crops that we use for animal feed. So green bar is showing growth rate, gray bar is showing protein content, and the black dots are showing the protein yield. So it's just the product of growth rate and protein content. So how much protein can you produce per area per time? And you can see duckweed produces like 5 to 10 times more protein than these common land grown crops. And this was kind of the basis. This figure was like what led me to do the rest of my PhD, because there is such a promising or big opportunity here. So looking at the safety, this duckweed that was harvested from that system, we dried it at different temperatures and durations to see inactivation of E. coli and total and fecal coliforms. So these are just indicator organisms that represent pathogens that are typically found in wastewater. We found that if you dry it for 48 hours at 40 degrees Celsius, you get complete inactivation, and at 60 degrees Celsius, only 4 hours. So I wanted to do like a kind of a life cycle impact to see the energy costs, to see what would be more sustainable, but I never did that. But that's something that you could look at to find like an ideal temperature to dry them at. And then this figure here is showing metals. So we looked at metals concentration in that biomass, and it was grown on various tanks. I don't really care that you look at the separate bars. What I want you to take home from this is that this red line is showing the animal feed limit for different metals, that you must be below this in order to sell your animal feed or whatever. So you can see that the duckweed is well below these limits for zinc, copper, lead, nickel, chromium, arsenic, and cadmium. So it's safe if you dry it sufficiently, basically. To look at protein quality, we did a study where we fed 30 mice that were in 6 different groups. So there were five mice per group. Each of those groups were fed one of 3 diets. One was a control diet where they used casein, that's a milk protein. That's typically what mice are fed, laboratory mice. And then we had 2 other diets where we substituted 10% of the protein with duckweed protein, and then 25% of the protein with duckweed protein. And these figures here on the bottom are showing the casein proteins. This is their control, like the white one. And then you can see the duckweed protein diet that has that green tint to it due to the duckweed. And we did this for 30 days and measured the mass of these mice, and found that there was no significant difference in the growth rates of the mice fed the 3 different diets. So you can kind of see there looks like there might be a trend going on here, where like the mice fed the more duckweed protein diet actually had higher growth rates, but statistics told me there was no difference here. But it would be interesting to see if you went to like 50 or 75% duckweed protein, how this would respond. And at the end of the experiment, we euthanized the mice and dissected them and weighed all of their organs. So we wanted to see if their organs developed the same. And we found that there was no difference again between the control group and the duckweed protein diets, except for this one weird kind of thing where the lungs were a bit bigger for the 25% protein diet to the control diet, but I think that may have just been a coincidence other than an effect on the protein. So the last kind of study I did for my PhD, my dissertation, was a life cycle assessment or an environmental impact analysis of this Penn State eco machine with duckweed production. So I looked at the eco machine in its natural state. So we heat it with propane. It's a greenhouse in Pennsylvania. It gets cold here, so we have to heat it over the winter. So I looked at, this would be like the eco machine as it is. I looked at replacing the protein with natural gas. I looked at no heat. So this would be like if it was, in the South or something where you wouldn't have to heat it. And then finally, like if you didn't need a greenhouse at all, if it was like an equatorial region that was nice all year round. The values here show kilograms of CO2 equivalents per million liters of water treated. So you can see, we're up here at like 1,000 or so kilograms of CO2 per million liter treated as it operates. But if you move that, down to natural gas, it gets increased to a 300. And then actually you have negative impacts here, which means like the duckweed that you're producing in the protein, I should say, that you're producing from the system is actually outweighing the detrimental impacts from, the pumps or the aeration or whatever that's going into it. So that was pretty cool to see because what you get back out could actually be more than what you put in. And if you compare this to conventional treatment, so on average, conventional treatment uses about 3,000 kilograms of CO2 per million liters treated. So even the eco machine at its natural state in a greenhouse, in Pennsylvania is still like a third of what you would see in conventional treatment. And then finally, I looked at, this is kind of like a preliminary study for a grant that was subsequently awarded, where I looked at a dairy farm in Pennsylvania that currently uses the manure from their dairy cows to grow soybeans. Those soybeans are then harvested and then added as a piece of the diet that's fed to the dairy cow. And this is really common. This is kind of how it's done in livestock operations. So I looked at what if we replace this soybean with duckweed? And I have some analyses here that show over a 20-year period, the amount of money. So this is like a economic analysis that I did based on the protein that you can produce. So if we look at a 5-acre field or a 10-acre field of soybean, this would be a pond essentially with duckweed. But you can see the amount of money that you can get based on the amount of excess protein you're producing is much higher for the duckweed. And then this figure on the right here is showing a bunch of different things where, again, we're looking at the monetary value of it with the bars here. But the lines are showing the percentage of the cow's protein that can be met. So, at 10 acres, we can meet basically 10% of the cow's protein by growing this duckweed, whereas soybeans down here at like 2%. And then I looked at also nitrogen and phosphorus removal. So those also follow kind of the same trend where you're removing more nitrogen from the manure or from the wastewater and you're getting a higher protein, which protein is made up of amino acids. Amino acids are made up of nitrogen. So it makes sense that would happen. All right, I know I flew through that last part. So that is all I have for you guys. Thank you for your attention. And I'm happy to answer any questions. But before I leave you off, if you want to look or think about this or want more information on this, there's a documentary that's available on Netflix called Cowspiracy. I know it sounds silly, but it's a very good documentary and it focuses on the environmental impacts of agriculture and food production. And I just want to, as a disclaimer, it doesn't go into like the horrors of the food industry like the documentary Food Inc. does, if you're familiar with that. It gives a lot of facts about the environmental impacts of agriculture, kind of similar to what I did in this presentation. But they have a lot more like pretty animations and stuff. So I think this is appropriate for elementary to high school students, I think. And I think really this is where it all starts is, if you can get this into a kid's mind or a teenager's mind and they go home and tell their parents, no, I don't want that steak. It requires 700 gallons of water, right? Like this is kind of what's going to start to shift these trends. So I think it's extremely important. And I hope that you guys agree or are on board with that also. But yeah, if you have any further questions or you want to talk about this more in detail, I'm happy to respond through email or we can set up a call or something. So there's my email there. So thanks.
Well, thank you to our presenter today for presenting. I guess there is some, it's like, oh, is that really the future? So there's kind of a a depressing note, but I guess your research has shown that there are, potential ways out there, and there's with some more research, there are some, positive opportunities happening. I guess Penn State, I'm guessing University Park, so pretty
Yes.
close to our backyards, right? So, in terms of the duckweed, is that something that could be used in a classroom? Like, is that something easy would there be any like applications for like a small scale experiment? Because it sounds like it grows pretty quickly, something maybe useful to,
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I grew it in a lab successfully at Penn State for many years. I've actually had issues recently trying to grow it here at St. Francis, but I don't think that has anything to do with the plant itself. I think it has something to do with the chemicals that I'm using from a locker that are like 50 years old. But yes, you can, grow duckweed in like a very small receptacle or something, just a beaker or anything. And under a grow light, you can see how quickly it grows. I'm trying to think like simple ways that you could test, like, I don't know, nutrient removal or stuff like that. But yes, for sure, you could grow duckweed in a classroom and like measure growth rate or something, and then based on like protein contents and stuff from the literature, you could calculate how much stuff you could build from that. Sure.
Do we have a question in the chat?
Yeah. So Sharon, that's funny that duckweed appeared in your home small pond, because yes, duckweed gets a bad rap. It's an invasive species, they call it, because it grows so fast and will grow like basically anywhere there's nutrient rich water. So the eco machine, where I did the research with the duckweed, my advisor inherited that in like 2010. This was before I even started my grad school. But when she got the system, it was out of commission. So she was trying to find plants or something to put back into it. And she was sort of just doing like a trial and error thing where, if the plant was growing well, she would leave it. If it started to die, she would take it out. And somehow duckweed, we think, just sort of piggybacked its way into the system. And we saw this plant growing, or she did, and was like, what the heck is this? She had no idea what it was. And then did a little research on it and figured out that, there was a lot of opportunities to do research like with this plant. And it kind of spurred from that, which was interesting. But yes, yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all that it just appeared also. And can humans consume duckweed? Yes. So in parts of like Southeast Asia, duckweed is, it's also known as water lentils. They are eaten pretty commonly. In the United States, not so much. Its cellulose contents is really, really low, so it's very easily digested. There's actually a place in Florida called Parabel that grows duckweed on like these massive racetrack ponds. And they sell this duckweed powder as like a protein powder. It's called Lentein, Lentein. You can order it on like Amazon. And people use it for like protein shakes or something. And it's like classified as like a superfood because not only is it high in proteins, it has a bunch of other like vitamins and omega-3 acids and stuff. I don't know. I'm not really up on my nutrition knowledge, but yes, it has a lot of benefits and humans can't eat it. Yeah, Gene. It requires like little funding, right? Like you can go find duckweed in Sharon's backyard and then, just like buy some cheap nutrient media online or something, or even make it yourself in the classroom. Yeah, and then, put a few fronds in there and let it do its thing under like a grow light or even in the window. Yeah, so it just has to do with, so the question is, can you briefly explain why chicken and turkey have less impacts on our food system? So I should have put a slide in here about this. Maybe it's like a backup slide or something, but pretty much in general, as a species becomes more advanced or larger or whatever, it becomes less efficient. So like cattle are huge, right? They have these massive stomachs and they're not efficient at all. Like we have to feed them constantly to keep them alive and, at the weight that we want them. So like they're just intaking a ton of calories compared to the amount of calories that you have in the meat that you're left with at the end versus like a chicken or a turkey or something is smaller, their lifespan is usually shorter. So the amount of calories that they intake is usually much lower than like a cow would over its lifespan compared to the calories that are in the meat. I hope that made sense. But there's so much information. If you just like Google, impacts of chicken versus cow or something, I guarantee like the first thing you'll find will have information about that.
Awesome. So we're coming up on the end of our hour here, but I want to thank our presenter again here. And if you have any more questions, of course, feel free to reach out to our presenter, or you can shoot an email to the Science Outreach account that you've got the invitation to this webinar from. But with that, I want to thank everybody for attending, and I hope where you are, it's nice and sunny as it appears to be here. So have a great day.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.